Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and today I have a guest that I spoke to almost 3 years ago, Dr. Ros Jones. And at the time, she was very outspoken about where the pandemic was going in terms of vaccines, especially for children in the UK. And it's quite fascinating to see the evolution of what happened. And critically, what I've done now is I've brought her back. And simply because they recently had the UK COVID inquiry, and in that one, they looked at vaccines and therapeutics. And we want to discuss, based on what has happened, where the gaps are, what probably should have been given more serious attention, and the lessons that can be learned. Now, what's important to note is that this is a very experienced clinician. Now, she is retired, which is why she is comfortable to speak out. And so we will learn quite a lot from this very objective view as to what has happened. Wherever you are in the world, please share so that I can put it on the screen. I'll do my best to put those up, and I will continue to put your questions out if you've got some good ones. So without further ado, let's add Ros to the stage. Thank you very much, Ros, for joining us. And if you don't mind just doing a quick introduction of yourself to the audience.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Philip, for having me back. Is it really 3 years? It probably is. Yeah, I was a consultant pediatrician, general pediatrics and neonatal intensive care, 40 years in the NHS. And I retired about 12 years ago now. So at the beginning of COVID, I was already well and truly retired. But interestingly, I got very quickly invited by the GMC back to work because they were re-registering anybody, whose registration had only ceased relatively recently to help. But of course, it was very obvious right from the word go that children were not affected by COVID, which was a blessing. And I sat at home feeling really guilty in the sunshine with a glass of white wine in the back garden, feeling this awful impending doom. Part of my job when I was working, I'd been clinical director for women and children's services, and I've been involved in pandemic planning for a swine flu outbreak. And interestingly, it was the same modeling, same Neil Ferguson model of, 80% of the population were going to get this disease. It maybe was going to kill 1 or 2%. That would mean at least 500,000 to 1 million deaths, all in the space of 10 or 12 weeks. And that was quite nerve-wracking. But of course, it wasn't how it played out. So when I heard all the same stuff coming up for COVID, I thought, I've heard this before. This does not feel right. So that's where I started. And quite quickly, I joined a group called Us for Them with Molly Kingsley and some other parents had set up for trying to get schools reopened, because it was very obvious that this was not something that children were going to be affected by. And we as a society were expecting children to protect adults. And that's not the right way around in my feeling, as whether as a parent, a grandparent, let alone as a pediatrician.
Excellent. And so when you started to get involved in that process, say, for instance, Us for Them, because at that time, it was really taboo to say anything that challenged vaccines, vaccine mandates, anything at all. What was the feedback or pushback that you had at the time?
Well, I think initially, it never occurred to any of us that they were going to roll this vaccine out to children anyway. If you look back in 2020, Matt Hancock and Kate Bingham, who was the vaccine czar, were very clear this was a vaccine for adults. In fact, Kate Bingham said it was for over 50s and the vulnerable. It was not going to be a vaccine for the whole population. So at the beginning, it wasn't an issue. But as things went by, it got more and more apparent that once the adults were getting vaccinated, there was this pressure for rolling it down to healthy younger adults. And there were people saying the sooner it got given to children, the better. Because, I quote somebody who was on stage, one of the professors who was at the inquiry, saying children would provide a sump of infection to reinfect adults. And we had to get, this thing, nobody's safe till everybody's safe. These little phrases you got from all around the world with the same phrase, very odd. But, that idea that we would be vaccinating children to protect adults is actually, in my view, against international law. And we might talk a bit more about that.
Well, I'm very curious for you to expand on that concept, because now we're getting the 2020 hindsight vision. And you were saying this from the start.
Yeah.
Why do you think that the pediatricians and the scientists, the academics who the government was trusting for guidance, were not seeing this obvious point?
It's very difficult. I mean, I think I've become more cynical, obviously, about the fact that academia, medical publishing, the colleges and so on all have a lot of money coming in from the pharmaceutical industry. We've had years of arguments with the College of Pediatrics at the meetings because we used to get sponsorship from Cow and Gate, and yet we were trying to persuade parents that they should be breastfeeding. And all our, you get a briefcase for the conference, and the conference notes were all Cow and Gate, and it didn't sit very comfortably. But this is just another aspect, isn't it? So the vaccine industry, the pharmaceutical industry have a lot of money in this. Now, in fairness to the college, I think the College of Pediatrics were very sensible. Their website, right through the first year, were reassuring to parents, far more than the government was being. They kept saying this is a very mild disease for children. Most children, you would barely know they'd even had it. There was a rare inflammatory condition that occurred post COVID, sort of about 6 weeks later or a month later, you might get a severe inflammatory condition, which did land some children in intensive care. But even the vast majority of them got better steadily. And so I think the college were very reassuring. And then when it went into 21 and the vaccines became available, they still were not pushing for vaccines for children. They were quite clear that they wouldn't be for children, but the only group that you could, I mean, always in medicine, as you would know yourself, you can give something that's within a protocol, but you can also go outside the protocol for good clinical reasons. So if you were a pediatrician and you had a child coming to you who had been admitted to intensive care with 3 previous chest infections, with the flu, they've landed up in intensive care. They were mostly talking about children with severe neurological disability. So if you've got severe cerebral palsy with perhaps a curvature of the spine and you've got poor lung function, therefore, you are at risk from any virus. It wasn't peculiar to COVID. But if there's a vaccine for this new disease, then it would be reasonable to get the children vaccinated on compassionate grounds. So that was always available. And they made it very clear, but that if you do that, you must explain to parents that this is a new vaccine without adequate safety data, with no data in children with disability, and really no data in children to speak of at all. So that went through till middle of March, I would think, 2021, this idea that it should just be for children with difficulties, severe difficulties. And then when eventually the MHRA, Pfizer were getting their drugs approved in the States. And actually, I was come in a bit before that. The first time I really was worried was when I was turned on the early evening news in February 2021 and saw Oxford University were advertising for children to join an AstraZeneca trial. And I wrote, in fact, then and there to Andrew Pollard, who was the lead clinician in the Oxford trial, and happened to be the chairman of the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunisation. And I knew him because that's the region I work in. And he replied within 10 minutes. It was 11 o'clock at night. I sent him off this email and he said, hi, Ros. Yes, you're quite right. We don't know whether it's safe for children. I just said I was really surprised that they would be starting a trial in children without waiting for the adult long-term safety data. And
one of the issues that I think a lot of people are tired around COVID. They don't want to hear anything more about it, and they just want to move on. Life move on. Why do you need to keep talking about this at this point? What is the relevance now other than a historical marker?
Well, I think there's two things, Philip. One is we've just had a hugely expensive public inquiry. And the fact is, I put in for, I've got this Children's COVID Vaccines Advisory Committee, and we sent letters to the MHRA, the JCVI, the minister, everybody you can think of, before this was licensed for children. So we weren't just shouting afterwards, we were highlighting all the risks. But and in the end, I wasn't accepted as a core participant for the module, but I was invited to do a witness statement, and that's a lot of work. You have to get all the references on this complicated government website, etc. And then, of course, they postponed the hearing for another 6 months because of the general election. It was meant to be in July 2024, so it got postponed. And then I didn't know whether I would be called or not. And then when I wasn't called, they still wouldn't say. At the beginning, they said, oh, please don't publish your witness statement, because we want to publish them as we go along during the hearings. As each witness comes, we publish their statement on the day. We don't want them published in advance. I thought, well, fair enough. But then when the hearings were over and I'd not been called, they still wouldn't say whether my witness statement would be published or not. And then we've come to the point where now in April, they finally published the whole report, and they still haven't published on the website my witness statement. The same goes for HEART and the Perseus Group and UK Medical Freedom Alliance. We were all given an opportunity and in fact invited under something called Rule 9 to provide witness statements. None of us were called to give evidence, and none of our witness statements have been published on their website. Now that seems to me they are frightened. Why didn't they ask us along? If we're really talking such a load of rubbish, it shouldn't have been difficult with all that panel of lawyers and experts to have said, no, actually, Ros, you've got this wrong because X, Y, and Z. It was like they could not risk us being there and showing what the harms of these vaccines are. I did a word search on children, and they are mentioned, but not very much. Children, yes.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is that even within that, they would not fit witness statements. And would you say that you're saying that they were probably afraid of making any connection with regards to
I got asked in advance if I was happy for my witness statement to be shared with Professor Heidi Larson, who was an expert witness that they'd invited to look at vaccine hesitancy. So I sort of said, yes, of course she can see my witness statement. I'd love to see hers, but I didn't get that in return. But what is apparent is that they've acknowledged vaccine injuries, but they've acknowledged them as being very tragic, but very rare. And they've acknowledged that the vaccine compensation system is not good enough. It's got this ridiculous thing, for example, you've got to be more than 60% disabled. So there was a guy who'd had his leg amputated because of a clot in his iliac, artery to his leg. And that wasn't sufficient disability. So here's a 40-year-old who's now got an artificial leg, but he doesn't get any compensation, even though they acknowledged it was definitely a vaccine-induced thrombocytopenic clot. But so that's the sort of thing. But the big message was they didn't want anything which would interfere with vaccine hesitancy. And vaccine hesitancy is on the WHO's top 10 list of international, dangers to the population of the world.
Now, I think that this is one of the biggies that I'm beginning to realize. So for me, prior to the COVID pandemic, I had never really given much thought to vaccines and the concerns. And you would almost look at hesitancy as among a small cohort of people who had very strong views. And what has happened since the pandemic is that we have seen a surge in vaccine hesitancy, especially around this point. And this is the point that I'm making. And they actually, not just around the point, they were very aware of this, and they put it in their message, if I can find it, which is that when you vaccinate someone, they are usually healthy. You cannot afford to make a healthy person ill because of a vaccine. It's very different from giving someone a drug, someone who is already ill, and then you're treating them. So this is a very significant point. And what I found when I looked at the inquiry, I'd looked at it in April as well, there did not seem to be any great interest in understanding the vaccine interest. So meaning that, yes, so you have myocarditis, but what is the mechanism? What about subclinical myocarditis?
Yeah.
How do we, there's so many questions around that should have been done that weren't done.
Yeah.
Is this just to protect the industry? I mean, or to protect public health? Who are they protecting?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think if you go back to what the things I was raising with the inquiry from a pediatric viewpoint were things like the ethics, the illegality, to my mind, of doing research in children, which is not for their primary benefit. And even the NHS adverts showing, say, a granny with a 7-year-old on her lap and the mum being told to bring your child in to have a vaccine to protect her vulnerable relatives. But that's not compliant with, it has to be for the child's own benefit. But the other aspect, which other groups put in more on than I did, but was about the background investigation of these technologies. And interestingly, I was in a meeting which Andrew Pollard was at, and I asked him, when you were asked to produce a vaccine quickly, what made you go for a novel technology, a new technology? Why not use a standard vaccine? And he said, oh, well, these were quicker. But the fact is they should have probably been regulated not as vaccines at all, but as gene products. And like you say, for a drug is being given to someone sick, but it still goes through much, much tighter hoops than vaccines. So if you look, for example, these vaccines, there's a question for, are they carcinogenic? And it just said, not applicable. And are they teratogenetic, like causing fetal abnormality? Not applicable. Now, if you're giving this to healthy population, it should be the other way around. If anything, you should be saying it's even more important that these are really, really safe. And, it's interesting because apropos of vaccine hesitancy, whenever I was interviewed in those early years, a friend pointed out that, they would always say, oh, now you're not an anti-vaxxer, are you? And I could honestly say, in my pediatric career, obviously I was recommending all the routine vaccines to all my patients. I wasn't pushing them, I have to say, but I was recommending them. Whether I would now is another question. But the point is that the whole system is geared to vaccination, that you don't have the same informed consent process. You roll up at a clinic, the fact that you've arrived is deemed to be consent. Whereas if you're having a drug, you'll know in your clinic, you'll sit down like somebody is having surgery. You'll sit down and you'll go through the pros and cons. Should we give this treatment? Should we give that treatment? And yet these vaccines, they go through on a much quicker system. And it is exactly the reverse of what should happen, to my mind. So one thing that particularly they missed out, which is vital, is they didn't do the basic pharmacology. So in children, there have been a few disasters in the past. I mean, thalidomide's the classic, isn't it? Nobody thought about the fact if it crosses the placenta, it was going to prevent, all sorts of blood vessel production and hence development of the fetus. But we've had things, chloramphenicol was an excellent antibiotic, but when you gave it to premature babies, they collapsed in a heap. It was called grey baby syndrome, not because it wasn't a good drug, but because their metabolism was different. Now here we've got a drug which even for adults, we don't know the dose they're giving you. If you take a hepatitis vaccine, you're given a fixed amount of hep B antigen, and then you'll make antibodies. But it's a prodrug. You're giving a genetic product, and you're saying, we're going to give you billions of pieces of RNA or DNA in the case of AstraZeneca, but a genetic model on which your cells will then make the spike protein. So it's first we've got to get some system for making it go into cells. So it's covered in little lipids and it goes into the cells. Then your cells make spike protein. Then the spike protein's got to come back out again to trigger your immune response. So it seems to me a very complicated way of, why not just give the spike protein in a fixed amount and get the immune system to do its job? But the
No,
problem is that it leaves you with, we're now in this situation that we have no idea how long people go on making it. How much would you make a different amount from me? Would children make a different amount from adults? And we've already, I mean, there was a paper only last month showing a guy who's still got spike protein in skin. He's got a skin reaction and multiple systemic reaction. But I think 1,364 days post-vaccination, they can still find in sequential biopsies that he is still producing spike protein and spike antibody.
I'm going to share something with you, because as you were talking, I realized that this information is quite relevant, and this is a point to flag it. What happened is that after the pandemic, because I've been focused on autoimmunity and autoimmune responses, and I kept on being told that there is no evidence of issues. And I was saying, if you don't look, you can't see.
Yeah.
So then I went and I got publicly available hospital episode statistics, and I then compiled it into a dashboard. And I'm going to show you something here, because this was one of the red flags, probably the most significant flag that came out across all age groups, all grouping, was in the obstetrics. And when you look at this, so this is showing you the trajectory from 2016 to 2025. And when you look at gestational hypertension, this is the pandemic point, 2021. This was the baseline. Yeah. Look at this. When you look at preeclampsia, look at this. When you look at pre-existing hypertension in pregnancy, look at that. Unspecified maternal hypertension. This was falling and then did a U-shaped curve. Hemorrhage in early pregnancy. This is an absolutely frightening trajectory for which we don't know if it is infection or otherwise. And this is what I mean, is that when they're doing these assessments, I was not happy that enough thorough detail, especially from my view, autopsy research, if you're seeing flags like that, every single placenta should be looked at, all of these things. What is wrong with because this is not necessarily the system, this is down to medicine as well.
Yeah.
Why is it that we are failing to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that, Philip. It's interesting because in Scotland, there was an obstetrician who was following very carefully all the neonatal outcomes when they were starting to roll out the vaccines to pregnant women in 2021. And in September 21, they follow, maternity has fantastic data. And, if you had a few more deaths than usual, it would go outside some predetermined 95% confidence, and it would bring up a red flag to say, what's going on? And so in September 21, there was an episode where there were the weekly neonatal death rates had shot up. And if you looked, it came directly after the peak, because they were publishing data on who was getting the vaccines, not just total numbers, but they had data on vaccinations in pregnancy. And there was this group of neonatal deaths following this. And they had an internal inquiry, and they said they couldn't work out what it was to do with. So then 6 months later, at the time when they were doing the boosters, there was another cluster of neonatal deaths after the boosters. Now, obviously, the fact that it's after doesn't mean it's caused by, but at least it means you must look. So then they got an external review, and the Scottish Health Department, which commissioned this review, specifically said they were not going to look at the vaccine status of the women because they didn't want to risk increasing vaccine hesitancy. And so they didn't look. So they'd got 30 deaths. And if you were doing a death inquiry, I did some in Oxford region, we used to do on any baby of 28, 29 weeks, we used to have to do a review for deaths, or like cancer deaths in children and so on. First thing you do is you go through the notes with a tooth comb and you look at everything, don't you? You don't decide in advance that you won't look. They only had 30 sets of notes they got to look up. And obviously, if they'd found, because only about most women, the majority didn't get vaccinated in pregnancy because I think they were worried, quite wisely. But, if 40% were vaccinated and then you looked at the deaths and you found 90% were vaccinated, then that would be, they said they couldn't think of a public health measure. Well, it would mean surely you would be thinking, perhaps we shouldn't carry on with this. But conversely, if they'd actually found that the deaths of the babies, the vaccination status of the mothers of the babies who died was exactly the same proportion as in babies who hadn't died, that could have been very reassuring. It might have reduced vaccine hesitancy, to be open and honest. And I did a freedom of information to 200 obstetric units in the country, asking them to look from 2018 through to 2022 at stillbirths, neonatal deaths, maternal deaths, pulmonary hemorrhage, hypertension, which you've mentioned, and so on, placental antepartum hemorrhage, etc. And I asked them also, and I got replies from lots of them giving this data. But what I asked them was, could they give me the data by COVID vaccination status? Well, only 10% of the hospitals had added COVID vaccine to their electronic database. And they said nobody asked us to. But it would have been such an easy thing. If they're talking about post-marketing surveillance, the very simple thing to have done would have been to ask the Department of Health, should have asked every obstetric department in the country to add this on as a field and made sure they looked. But they didn't look.
No, listen, the more I listen to you, Ros, and this touches a nerve for me in the sense that I recognize that there is a fear of finding a problem. Okay, so it's not that people aren't curious. It's not that they don't want to know. The problem is that if you looked and you found what could be relevant, what do you do with the information? Because if you then publish the information, you then become the target for this kind of issue. When you think about what it was like working in pediatrics, so you are in the luxury position of being retired. Do you think you could have or would have asked some of these kinds of questions if you were only 10 years in as a consultant with 15, 20 years before you retired?
I hope I would have had the courage to do that, Philip, but I'm not sure. And it was interesting because I wrote to all my ex-colleagues to see if any of them wanted to sign my letter to Andrew Pollard about the children's AstraZeneca vaccine. And I didn't get replies from most of them. And these were, current consultants who'd been my registrar, people I'd got on really well with. And when I went back later for some social event, they were talking about masks in the children's ward and, how awful it was. They all agreed it was absolutely awful. And we all knew it didn't work. But somehow they allowed it to happen. And I just thought, how could you have parents masking in a children's ward? It's just wrong. It was so frightening. It was so dystopian, the way we treated children. We had schools telling the parents they must wear a mask in the playground when they came to fetch their kids at the end of the day. And these children coming out to a sea of masks, which is effectively telling the children that the adults are frightened of the children, isn't it? You might be horrible disease-ridden kids. We don't want you anywhere near us because we might catch COVID. The whole thing has been quite appalling. And I know you're right. People want to put it behind them. But the worry is if we don't learn lessons before we put it in the past, then when the next pandemic, which they're all, you can see the scaremongering every time, whether it's monkeypox or hantavirus or, they're itching for another one. And it will come, whether it's real or from, exaggerated, it'll come with the same fear-mongering we had. And they were talking about the next one might be one that had a higher case fatality rate for children. Well, then maybe all the people who are saying now, oh my goodness, I wouldn't do that again. Will they say that? It's hard. And my real worry, as I said about the mRNA technology, is that it's getting rolled out now for other vaccines. There's a flu vaccine that's just been approved in the States, where there were 5 deaths, I think, in the vaccine mRNA vaccine arm and only 1 in the standard flu technology arm. I mean, these are elderly patients with vulnerabilities, so it's not unlikely that somebody might die over 6 months, but 5 to 1 against the thing you're trying to promote, and yet they're still wanting to promote it.
You know, interestingly, I when I was censored some years ago, I was censored because I took the data from the original Pfizer research on the COVID vaccines. And at that point, you had the full supplemental data, including all the things that happened beyond the November 14 cutoff. So in effect, in order for them to submit the paper, they needed a cutoff date. The cutoff date was in November 14th. So I simply asked the question, if the cutoff was the 30th of December, what would have been the outcome? And the outcome was not good. So it just shows, and then that got censored. It was their own data. It was just me looking at it. So we are definitely dealing with something here that is beyond just health. Okay. Because from a clinical point of view, you know, doctors gain very little from following the rules. They just go along with the protocols. Who would have the benefit from this very, very strict top-down focus on anyone asking questions?
Well, I think it feels as if it's about control. I think one of the advantages that the UK had during COVID was, and with it came to the vaccines, was that we've never traditionally had mandatory vaccines for anything. So, you know, in France, if it's not compulsory, but you can't get your child benefit if you didn't have your little carnet de santé, that sort of health book, with all your clinic, their developmental checks and their vaccines were all up to date. And each week or month you went for your cash handout, your child benefit, you had to show that you'd got your vaccine data up to date. And the same has happened now, it's coming into more and more countries. Brazil, they've had children being taken into care. They're still giving, in Brazil, they're still doing COVID vaccines from 6 months upwards. You see, here it's interesting, we've just quietly dropped it. So we very quickly, I mean, we never went down below 5 years of age, and only 10% of primary school children got given a COVID vaccine. And I have to say, I take a little credit for that, because although we didn't manage to shift the regulators, I had a lot of parents saying that by giving detailed, referenced information, it can kind of give them the courage to stick with their gut instinct, which was they really didn't think children needed this, and it was all far too new. But I think we've got to the point now where there is getting to be more pressure. There are parents who are choosing not to get their children vaccinated, who in the past would have just been thought, well, you know, they're a bit wacky, but that's up to them. And they're now finding social services are getting involved. And I've been doing quite a lot of medical legal work, which, you know, where there's been parental dispute and the law courts are trying to start saying, oh, you know, this child needs to have their tetanus jab. And you think, really? And in Hungary, for example, they have to have hepatitis B before they leave hospital. And so that's not because the mum's got hepatitis B, even if the mum is negative, in which case there is no risk to the baby. It's a nonsense. But if they're not giving it consent, those babies are getting not taken into care, but they're getting forcibly vaccinated and then returned to the mother. And if they then don't get the batch at 2 months, if they're repeat offenders, the child will probably go into care.
I'm going to ask you a hard question here, Ros. It seems almost counterintuitive that you spent most of your career with children in pediatrics, as you said, recommending not pushing vaccines. But the way how you sound at the moment, you may be on the radar for the WHO to not want to be talking. How do you get to this point?
I know, it's been gradual. I think because I started doing the medico-legal work for parents for the COVID vaccines, that was relatively easy because so few parents were giving them. So in a way, the parent who was asking was the one who was out of line, actually. And the parent who was saying no was the one who was just following the majority of being cautious. But then, of course, I think some of the parents who were pushing this, they got braver and started saying, oh, well, you know, we could get, it's being used as a tool in marital breakdown, which is sad, you know, where, say, a child who has now a 10-year-old and hasn't had any vaccines, and the absent parent had never shown any interest at all before, and now suddenly they're saying, oh, they need them. So I think, you know, I think the thing is you need to look at parental choice, you need to look at information. I'm not saying I would be against giving any vaccines whatsoever, but I think we are giving an awful lot of vaccines in very close proximity. I was just looking back myself, you know, I personally had only 2 vaccines in infancy. That wasn't because my parents were anti-vax, it's because that's all there was. 1 dose of smallpox and 1 dose of diphtheria. And then I got the polio vaccine when I was about 7 and a TB vaccine when I was about 13. So when I started medical school, I'd had precisely 1, 2, 3, 4 jabs. Now, newborns in the UK don't get anything, but in a lot of countries they do. But we start at 8 weeks with 8 antigens at 8 weeks, and at 12 weeks, another 8 antigens. So by 4 months, they will have had 24 antigens. Well, that's more than I've had in my entire life. And I've had every vaccine I've been offered. So I worry about that. And yeah.
So it raises some big questions, because at the moment, the public health is struggling with the fact that so much of the population have been turned off of all vaccines because of what happened in the COVID pandemic, where whether or not it was somebody who was injured, a family, and they have come to the recognition that actually the people who were mandating and pushing the vaccines don't actually really care about their outcomes. You know, it's just like, just do it. If you get a bad outcome, well, we accept. So this is now causing people to reflect carefully on all vaccines. Now, this is a big problem. Now, as I said, I had never really had any issues with the previous vaccination rollout with children. But as I said, recently I had the conversation with Dr. Dov Gebian, who was talking about diaphragmatic cramp or spasm in children as a cause of SIDS. And I was horrified to see that, you know, it was 78% were within 7 days of being vaccinated. Now, these are children where the parents would have thought it was connected to the vaccine. And so that kind of data does make you worry that there hasn't been as much research as there should have been in looking at adverse outcomes for children. Is that a fair?
I think that is fair. I think it's interesting if you're talking about SIDS. In the States, there used to be a category that you could put on a death certificate, which was vaccine injury. And it's actually been removed from the coding system. So you can't now say that, even if you think that's the cause of death, you can't put it down. It doesn't exist. And I think, you know, autism's been obviously the big one that everybody's worried about. But I think, again, autism, it has become much more prevalent. But the thing that people were talking about mostly is not the being just on the spectrum, but these kids with acute, severe regression. And I think probably calling it autism isn't necessarily helpful. It may be better to call it acute brain injury. And again, that when that occurs directly after vaccine, and then people tell you you're making it up or it's irrelevant, it's coincidence. And just general health, you were talking about autoimmune conditions, inflammatory conditions. It's interesting, I'm sure you've probably watched Del Bigtree's film, An Inconvenient Study. And if you haven't, I would certainly recommend it, and to your viewers, because he got a very pro-vax guy from the Henry Ford Big Medical Institute to say he would do a study looking at the health of all the children who were enlisted in this program. So they get their vaccines there, and they also get all their health care. So that they've got all this data, and they would compare the 80% who were vaccinated with or 85%, and with the 15% whose parents had chosen not to have them vaccinated. And they would look over a 5-year period at their general health. And they were promised that they were going to actually publish it, whatever the outcome. So he obviously was expecting, this guy was expecting to find that the vaccinated were healthier than the unvaccinated, because surely that's the whole point of doing it. But what he found was a bit awkward, because like you were saying earlier, if you don't want to look, because what do you do with the information? And then what he found was that there was a 3-fold increase in asthma, in other allergic conditions, in neurodisability, a whole host of conditions were commoner. Just any chronic illness was more likely in a child who'd had any vaccines than the children who'd had no vaccines. And then he just didn't publish it. So 5 years went by, and they're thinking, what's happened to that? I'm sure he's finished it. And they'd seen the sort of original proofs. He'd sent it to them, and they'd said, oh, that's interesting. And we're waiting for it to appear in print. And he just hadn't published it. So in the end, Dell kind of pinned him down to say, look, why haven't you published it? And this chap, who was in his 60s, he wasn't like 40, he was not that far off retiring, but he still said, if I publish it, it's the end of my career. And so he wouldn't publish it. And now it's been published by Aaron Siri. I think it's in a Senate, you can read it because it's been put in a Senate hearing, so it's available, but it's still not gone into a peer-reviewed journal.
So here is what I'm beginning to think. And this is where I think that when you do transparent research, so say, for instance, Professor Stabel Ben from Denmark wanted to do research looking at children who had hepatitis B vaccine at birth compared to those who didn't, because they hadn't brought in the strict rules about doing it all at birth. They had about 3 years before they did.
Yeah.
And that research was completely shunted because they said it was unethical. And I'm thinking, well, the children are still not getting the vaccine. Why can't you look at the outcomes? So there seems to be a clear anxiety about outcomes. Now, let me what I'm saying is anti-vaccine. No, I think what we're likely to find is that there is a subset of situations or children who need an adjusted vaccine schedule. And if you know who they are, you can then risk stratify them and minimize longer term injury. Why would this be such a big problem?
I don't know. And I think, it was really interesting. We were talking earlier about Andrew Wakefield, because when he did his paper on the MMR vaccine, it was only 12 children in a pilot study, and these were parents that had come because of he was a gastroenterologist, and he was biopsying these kids, and these parents, 12 parents or 11 of them, said they were really worried that their gut symptoms had come on after they'd had their MMR. Now, he actually, it's interesting, you look back at that paper, and the outcome at the end, the conclusion was very cautious. It was just saying, this is interesting information. It's a pilot. We need to look further. But he was being pushed to say, would he recommend MMR? And he said, which I thought sounded very reasonable, well, we could just go back to measles on its own and then give the rubella in secondary school, which is what, until 10 years ago, what they had been doing. I mean, the measles vaccine had been around for 25 years with nobody raising concerns. So he thought it was about the number in, altogether, or could be. He didn't say it was, but he said it could be. Why don't we just go back and then we'll look further at more children and see if we can reach a conclusion. But as you know, his career was absolutely, he was torn apart. But it's interesting because I remember at the time, there were parents saying they wanted to have the vaccines separately. And we were being, as pediatricians, told, oh, no, you mustn't do that. We're only recommending them together. Well, there was nothing to say they were more effective together. It was just that if they get them separately, it's a bit spread out. They probably won't come back and get them all. They might forget. So that seems to be, it was a very paternalistic view. And actually, if you've got parents who are really worried about MMR, but there's a lot of outbreak of measles around, and they're saying, you know what, I would get a measles vaccine for my child, but I don't want MMR. Why would you deny them that choice? And for several years, there's been a company in a London-based, Baby Jabs UK, and they've got a clinic in Leicester and in Manchester, and they used to give just polio or diptep pertussis 3-in-1. They would space them out. You know, our very hard schedule is much more than, say, in Denmark. In Denmark, they do 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months with 5 doses, and we're doing 2, 3, and 4 months with 8 doses. So it's not as if there is a right answer, but we're so keen to push the absolute protocol, and you mustn't deviate. Now, this company have for years given measles alone, and I think they've done a good service to a lot of parents who were worried about MMR and thought, well, I'll get just the measles vaccine. But they have now been blocked by the MHRA have blocked them importing it. So it's now illegal for them to import it. It's still being produced in India, the individual vaccine. And they said, you know, if you're a British Indian with family in India, you could just go on holiday and get your child vaccinated while you're there. But that's not very realistic for, you know, a UK parent to think, oh, I'll just go to India to get my child vaccinated.
So this is, the more, as I said, the more I listen and the more I objectively assess, because there are some children who are at risk for hyperimmune responses. And these are the children who usually have eczema and asthma, the atopic kind of, you know, children. And so it would seem purely logical that restricting the amount of antigen that they're exposed to in a short period of time should be beneficial. So where we are now, and this is where I think that things like AI can be very valuable, because I don't think we can use the paternalistic excuse any longer that parents would forget, because now we have technology that can make sure
you get reminders all the time.
Just remind us all the time.
Of course.
And so what we need now is very clear strategic understanding. So say, for instance, I'm glad you had mentioned Andrew Wakefield, because when I had looked at the paper, what had stood out to me was not whether or not he had massaged the history, but that 11 of the 12 children had nodular hyperplasia, I think, of the intestinal wall. And so I'm thinking that if these children, who are probably the fussy eaters, who have recurrent tummy pain, it may indicate that they are at risk for hyperimmune responses. And so therefore what you would then do is an adjusted schedule. So it's not that you don't do it, you just do it in a different way. I don't know if why is this so difficult?
I mean, I agree. And I think the trouble is that all the time of shutting down any injury, it's the same, we come back where we started, which was with the COVID vaccines. If you shut down discussion about injury, you know, when somebody whose husband has died of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia, and she's put a death certificate up on Twitter, and it's taken down as misinformation. Well, it's not misinformation, it's what he died of. You know, and all the time we're doing that, we are not addressing, well, now, why did that guy get that problem when most people didn't? Because obviously, if the vaccine had killed 50% of the people who received it, then they would have got stopped within the first sort of week, probably. But because obviously most people seem to be okay, we've pushed on with it. But we're not using the data. We're not trying to. Like, as you said, there's not enough post-mortems. I think the other thing is just, you know, even blood tests, you know, with people with, because I think one of the problems for COVID is this multi-systemic problem, which is unusual for it's ongoing. And I think that's because people are still making spike protein ongoing. And that's why I think it's such a fundamentally dangerous technology for other vaccines, because it wouldn't matter. It wasn't because it was spike protein particularly. I mean, that might be bad, but if it was the, fusion F protein for respiratory virus, it still might be bad if you went on making it ad infinitum. So unless we look properly and systematically at the basic chemistry in the first place, and also I think all the trials that we do must have a long enough duration. I think we've seen lots. I mean, the booster trials, some of them, they only did rat studies, and some of the children's trials, they did some so-called immunobridging. They said, well, if the kids make the same amount of antibodies as the adults, then we'll assume it works. Well, that may be fair enough, but it's not to say you can assume it's safe because they're making antibodies. And so the whole thing, I think any trial, I think it's true, if you say give antihypertensives, we're very keen to reduce the target blood pressure now, and then you're an elderly person and you stand up and you faint and you break your leg, and then you die of post complications of your fractured femur. Nobody attributes that to the fact that you had your antihypertensive drug increased only last week because the protocol has changed and now says that even if you're 90, your blood pressure target should be 120/70, which is the same as the target for a 19-year-old. So we're so keen in all aspects. We've become so protocol driven, I think, to the exclusion of personalized patient care. And that probably is making our practice much less safe.
I think that, as we're coming to the close here, Ros, I think that one of the things I have observed and I recognize, and I can see it even in the comments that people are making. So people are making comments all the time that a significant proportion of the population no longer trusts doctors. Okay. They don't trust the government. They don't necessarily trust public health, but because the doctors did not advocate for them, they don't trust them either. How do we fix that? Because we know that generally the doctors really care about their patients. They just don't want to get into trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult to fix unless there is some sort of official top-down change. We've got doctors who are being struck off by the GMC for following the GMC's own guidance, which is to first do no harm and raise any patient safety issues promptly and put patient safety at the heart of your medical practice. So until we fix that, doctors, I'm afraid, they're only human. Some will go above and beyond. And then when they have and they've got struck off, of course, it puts the rest into an even more anxious position of thinking, I can't say a word. It's easy for me because from a position of retirement, I had nothing to lose. And that's why I've gone on, because you might think, well, why don't I just forget it all? I don't need to. Nobody's paying me anything to do any of this. But I sympathize with the people who aren't speaking out. They should be speaking out. And if enough people did all at once, we'd get somewhere. I've just got a letter, there'll be a letter winging off to our 6th Prime Minister, but, calling for the mRNA vaccines to be completely suspended following for a proper independent safety review. So, people can sign letters and they're very welcome to do that. But at the end of the day, advocating for your patient, I think, has to be the top priority, and listening to your patient and discussing the pros and cons and giving them enough time and not pushing. But you see, there's still financial incentives. If you go and get your well-manned clinic and it says your cholesterol's more than 5.1, you'll get called to your GP and they'll be recommending a statin. And they'll get their payment upgrade if they get 90% of eligible patients on statins. And the same would apply if you get 90% of your children vaccinated. Well, once you get to the point when you've only got 80%, you're going to miss out on a lot of money.
Yeah, these are so we are in a situation here where I don't see any easy ways out. And my feeling is that the medical community is going to have to do the hard work of rebuilding the trust and not
Yeah.
allowing themselves to be in the firing line, because this is what has happened, is that the public perceive that it's their own doctors who are driving this agenda, not realizing that they
Yeah.
have nothing to do. They have to follow the rules. They
But
can't.
that's the point. They don't have to follow the rules, do they?
Well, yeah.
They feel as if they have to, and
They
I
feel as though
understand
they
that, but
have to
they
follow
don't.
the rules, you know.
Yeah.
And so when you look at that, this is a very difficult situation, and I expect it to get worse, largely because um, people like myself are still talking about COVID vaccines and COVID vaccine injury. And I think there is a hope that as time goes by, people will forget about the pandemic and not make the connection to the worsening population health with
Mm.
what happened in the pandemic. So this is why
Mm.
I think that there is a hope that if you leave it long enough, the public will forget.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think they may be right.
Yeah. No,
Because
I think that's right. People want to
yeah,
just get on with life.
that's right.
But I find it quite right. I just keep seeing, I seem to be going to a lot of funerals, and it's just miserable. You talked to Gus Dalgleish, you were showing those pictures of hypertension going up. You can look at similar pictures for cancer rates going
Yeah,
up.
yeah,
Edward Dowd has done some really good stats, again, using UK health data in the same way that you have, and showing the number of undiagnosed primary, so in other words, rapidly progressive, of unknown primary in the 15 to 45 age group. And that's worrying. And they keep talking about these increase, and it's such a puzzle. And you think, okay, and is anybody looking at their vaccine status?
no,
And it's not
no,
much help. And I think that's the other thing we said, why doctors don't speak out, is one of the things is, of course, many doctors were themselves vaccinated, and also they will have been recommending it to their patients at a stage when they hadn't done their own homework. They presumed, and I think I feel guilty of this myself, because I had the time and because COVID, it was so obvious. It was completely brand new technology. I couldn't find any proper safety data. And it was all produced within, 6 months of a apparently new organism. But I think, when you look back, you realize that lots of things, the safety data isn't really as good as it should be. And so I think people then feel rather guilty, and then you double down, because it's hard to face up to the fact that you may have been causing your patients harm. But I think a lot of the vaccine injured will say something which is really upsetting, is they'll go and see a specialist who'll say, oh, this is definitely vaccine injury, but won't write it in the notes and won't put it on the letter. And, GPs who would sit in the coffee room saying, oh, I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated. And yet they'll go and do a clinic vaccinating other people's children. And it's not right.
yeah, wonderful. Listen, thank you very much, Ros. As usual, very thoughtful, very clear. We are lucky to have advocates like you, and I'd encourage you to continue to speak, to share, and to drive the medical, scientific, and public to think carefully about what has happened and how it's relevant to the future of what is likely to happen if more questions aren't asked. I remind everybody listening that in the long run, as you were told with regards to the COVID pandemic, is that no one will be responsible, no one will be accountable. In the same way, if you don't make the decisions for yourself and those around you, nobody will end up being responsible or accountable in the future either. So I encourage people to ask harder questions. I think that's what a journalist said, and I think it's true. Ask harder questions. So thank you again, Ross, and I'll just ask you to wait with me for the outro. And thanks everyone for being with us.
Thank you, Philip, for having me.